Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. I wanted this video to be a response video to an article I read in New York Magazine maybe 2 days ago. The headline was "The Hard Questions About Young People and Gender Transitions," and the reporter was Andrew Sullivan. Let me start by just reading an excerpt from the article that I think kind of sums up the tone. So he starts by writing, "Earlier this week I met a group of women in their early 20s who are not supposed to exist," which right off the bat, not supposed to exist, sounds so sensationalized. They're women who, in their teens, realized that they were actually men, socially transitioned to the other sex, and then underwent hormone therapy to change their bodies, faces, and voices to become transgender men. People do not transition into the other sex necessarily. I think a lot of people experience gender dysphoria and not so much sex dysphoria. I know genital dysphoria is absolutely a real thing, but in this particular instance, saying that they transition to a different sex is completely irrelevant. After varying amounts of time, however, they all realized they had made a big mistake. Big mistake. Stop testosterone therapy and detransition back to being who they were before. They definitely did not detransition back to who they were before, because I can guarantee that the experience that they had exploring their gender made them grow and change as a person, and they did not go back to who they were before because they actually allowed themselves to explore their gender in a really full way. These women live every day with the consequences of their decision. Tenacious facial hair, one has to shave every 3 days, and body hair, deeper voices, permanently enlarged clitorises. Call me crazy, but I don't know if having a larger clitoris is a consequence. I'm sure there are a lot of women who have large clitorises that would probably be offended by that comment. And the reporter goes on to finish the article by saying, "All I know for sure is that too many of these irreversible calls have been wrong ones. I know that gender dysphoria throughout childhood is one thing. Sudden gender dysphoria among teenage girls is another." I'm being like, what the heck am I reading? Like, what is this? Like, what is the point of this article? And what is it really going to do in the media landscape for, conservative and bigoted voices to then take these types of articles and say, look what New York Magazine's writing about. They're writing about trans youth that are ruining their bodies, ruining their lives, making choices that are not good for them. And it just adds to this idea that, like, being trans is somehow going to be a harmful thing to society and to children especially, which I just feel like is such a sensationalized way of framing this conversation. And it absolutely privileges cis people's lives over trans people's lives, because if we allow more access to care and a more self-affirming way of allowing a patient to identify when they're younger, I think that will ultimately save a lot of trans lives. There is such a high suicide rate amongst trans people, and it's like, because maybe some people within this, who are not even trans are deciding that they may be trans and then realize that they're not. Like, why is that such a big deal? Like, I think it's valid. Like, people who detransition, like, share your stories. Like, it's super valid. It's okay. It's okay to try on different pronouns. It's okay to, have variant gender expression. And, when you're younger, especially before puberty, like, why not, play and see what feels right to you? Why do you have to suffer to be a trans person? Why is it so bad to claim a trans identity and then decide it's not right for you? And why do we privilege cis people over trans people and worry so much about, especially the way it was worded in this article, the the consequences and sort of like the grotesque way that this author or, you know, reporter was describing the body hair and the deeper voices and the permanently enlarged clitorises, as if they were describing some sort of like mutant being. And I think that there's definitely certain components of the article that are, dare I say, well-intentioned, or are, you know, part of a narrative that, like, we all kind of want to make sure that we are as thoughtful and as caring as possible to youth who are gender dysphoric, but may not, you know, ultimately decide that being trans is ultimately who they are. Which, again, what is the point of this article? To share your concern about people you don't even know transitioning and then deciding it's not the best choice for them? Like, I didn't get any sense of personal connection that this reporter had to either a trans person in their family or their own sort of trans narrative or experience with gender dysphoria. It just was a critique from a cis person who seemed to not have any perspective on what it is and what it means to be trans. And I did a quick Google search of Andrew Sullivan as a reporter, and he seems to have a bit of a controversial background as being someone who is a bit more conservative. I have no idea why New York Magazine is platforming someone like Andrew Sullivan. I live in New York, and I've always read New York Magazine as being a publisher that I could trust and that I enjoyed, you know, a lot of the articles that I've read, but I have heard in the past that they can be a transphobic news outlet, and I now see what people are talking about because they are giving, you know, headline space to a cisgender conservative reporter who seems to not really have any agenda to help the trans community, only report on something that is purely based on their own perspective and, quite frankly, offers nothing to the trans community at all. If this becomes a children's issue, not a trans issue, which gives any reader, cis or trans, permission to weigh in on the subject with authority, it's that classic think of the children straw man. And I think that's well put, because it's so easy for someone who's bigoted to somehow find or think they have the upper hand in an argument when you start saying, well, what about the children? And it's like, I think everyone generally wants to protect children, but when you're talking about this conversation, we're not talking about the experience of trans people. We're talking about what sounds like someone who had a bad therapist, or someone who, you know, had parents who maybe weren't capable of fully helping their child understand that their gender dysphoria ultimately wouldn't lead to, you know, transition. Which, again, I think is totally acceptable to have a child try something on for size. I mean, that's when you're supposed to do that. And it's nice to think that there can be a generation of children who were given the permission to explore their gender and solidify their gender before puberty told them that this is the path that their body was going to take. I've spent so much time on things like facial hair removal, as well as, you know, just having the body of someone who went through a male puberty, and trying to reverse that is not only very hard to do, but unfortunately, in a world that is extremely binary, it makes it that much harder for people to see the gender you feel you are versus, you know, the gender that you were assigned at birth. And I think that there needs to be less pressure to be a certain type of woman or a certain type of man or a certain type of any person, a certain type of human being. But I will not share and acknowledge the reality of the way in which most people experience and perceive gender. And because that's a reality, I think we have to be having better conversations on how and who is given access to care, and the rigidity that we sometimes approach the idea of someone being trans, and especially a child who is just trying to be themselves. We shouldn't be jumping down their throats one way or the other. And if we're talking about children who are detransitioned or detransitioning, that's perfectly fine. It's part of the narrative, but it shouldn't be the dominant part of the narrative. So that is basically everything I wanted to say in response to the Andrew Sullivan New York Magazine article. I do think that there are some good aspects to the article, including a link to a study which was titled Affirmative Practice with Transgender and Gender Non-Conforming Youth, Expanding the Model. And I think that it's a really interesting study and provides a set of framework and guidelines to providers who work with gender non-conforming, non-binary, and trans youth, which I think are pretty helpful. And I think, ultimately I think Andrew Sullivan is coming from this from a, cisgendered, gay perspective, and I know at one point in the article he even questions, what role does homophobia play in enabling transition? And I think that questions like that are extremely valid, and I think that they're important as part of the set of questions that any person who's questioning their gender should ask themselves. I think it's incredibly thoughtful to think about other reasons why someone may have gender dysphoria and other solutions that could be considered aside from transition. But I don't think it should be brought up within the framework of an article like this with a very controversial headline, which only, like I said before, adds fuel to a fire that really, quite frankly, is already burning ablaze based on not only this current administration, but a lot of conservative news outlets being anti-trans. Okay, well, that's everything. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you can like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, that would be amazing. And please have a look at my other platforms, which include Pinterest and Instagram, linked below. Thank you very much. Bye.